It's May 13th, 1862. The Civil War is at its peak. Millions of black men, women, and children are trapped in chains, forced to do the bidding of their white master, beaten, whipped, abused, and exploited. The southern sun beats heavily on their heads. But one man has had enough. One man has decided he would show America the real power of the black man. And he was going to do so in the most crazy of ways. The Confederate Army has laid one of their most heavily armed ships, the USS Planter, in Charleston Harbor, the most fortified harbor in the South. And on one foggy morning, the ship vanished, not because it was destroyed, but because a 23-year-old black man, born to become human property, stole it right out from under the noses of his white captors. His name was Robert Smalls, and what he pulled off that day wasn't just bold or dangerous. It was downright impossible. He had hijacked the ship and gone through 5 Confederate checkpoints, while his family and friends hid below deck. And somehow, against every odd, he made it out alive. What followed would leave America stunned. In a country that once called him property, viewed him as less than human, he would become a military hero, a political leader, and a face of defiance in a world set to dehumanize and degrade him. Today on Black Stories Untold, we're uncovering the tale of how one black man forever changed the course of American history. Most heroes aren't born, they're made, and Robert Smalls was no exception. Born in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1839, Robert entered the world like millions of other black children, predetermined to a lifetime of unpaid labor and subjugation. His mother, Lydia Polite, was enslaved, likely making Robert the son of plantation owner John McKee, though Robert never publicly confirmed this. While most enslaved mothers did everything in their power to shield their children from the reality of their existence, Lydia did something different, something that would seem cruel if you didn't understand the devastating genius behind it. She deliberately exposed her young son to enslavement's darkest corners, even going as far to arrange him to work in the fields and witness punishments at the whipping post. That's because she understood something that we don't. Ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dangerous. She needed her son to understand exactly what kind of world he was fighting against. And fight he did. By age 12, that carefully cultivated defiance had already landed Robert in jail. Most mothers would have been devastated, but Lydia saw an opportunity. Seeing this, Lydia made another fateful decision. She arranged for Robert to be sent to Charleston to work. In Charleston, working on the docks, the young Robert earned $16 a week, but was permitted to keep only $1 for himself. The rest went straight into his enslavers' pockets. Yeah, $15 of that went straight to the pockets of the same man who had whipped him and kept him in chains. Can you imagine? Working every day just to have the same person who kept you in chains take all your hard-earned money? But what his enslaver couldn't take was the knowledge Robert was accumulating every single day. Working various maritime jobs, Robert developed an intimate knowledge of Charleston Harbor, its channels, its tides, its defenses. He learned to pilot vessels through the harbor, and by his early 20s, he had become a wheelman, an unofficial pilot for the Confederate ship, the CSS Planter. During these years, Robert met and fell in love with Hannah Jones, an enslaved hotel maid, and together they dreamed of freedom. But not the abstract, wishy-washy, I'll get free someday mentality that kept many going. No, Robert was going to earn freedom for himself and his family by any means necessary. In fact, he had calculated the price of freedom. It was $700. That's how much he'd need to purchase his wife and their daughter, Elizabeth. But $700 when he was only allowed to keep just $1 a week from his labor meant their freedom would take 13.5 years of saving every single penny. And by then, more children might be born into slavery, pushing the goal even further away. It was this brutal reality that pushed Robert toward a more dangerous gamble. If he couldn't buy freedom, he would have to seize it with his own hands. But to steal freedom in Charleston Harbor, the most heavily defended Confederate port, would not only require courage, but maybe favor from God himself. Luckily, Robert had something better. If you're feeling the power of Robert Small's story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These are the stories they never wanted us to know, but we're telling them loud and clear here on Black Stories Untold. By 1862, the Civil War was raging across America. The Union blockade was slowly choking Charleston, cutting off vital Confederate supply lines. And smack dab in the middle of this naval chess game was a ship called the CSS Planter. But this wasn't just any vessel. With its shallow draft and superior cargo capacity, it had become the Confederacy's lifeline, ferrying troops, weapons, and supplies between their fortified positions. For Robert Smalls, the Planter wasn't just any ship. It was his workplace, where he served as the wheelman, the man who actually steered the vessel while the white captain only gave orders. The white officers trusted him implicitly. After all, why wouldn't they? In their minds, the institution of enslavement had broken men like Robert, stripped them of ambition, of courage, of the very capacity to imagine freedom. But their tiny minds wouldn't have been able to comprehend Robert's brilliance. For months, Robert had been studying every detail of Charleston Harbor's defenses. He memorized the signal codes that changed weekly. He observed the routines of the Confederate officers, noting that they often spent nights ashore with their families. He analyzed the patrol patterns of Confederate gunboats. And most importantly, he assembled a crew, 7 other enslaved men who worked aboard the Planter, men who shared his desperate hunger for freedom. Then came the night that would change everything. May 12, 1862. The 3 white officers of the Planter disembarked for the evening, leaving Robert and his fellow enslaved crewmen aboard. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. His wife Hannah and their young children were hiding nearby, along with the families of other crew members. In total, 16 people, 8 men, 5 women, and 3 children, would attempt this escape together. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If caught, they faced torture, sail to the brutal plantations of the Deep South, or worse, execution. Just before 3 a.m. on May 13th, Robert gave the signal. The boilers were stoked. Black smoke poured from the Planter's stack. The crew cast off lines and the vessel slipped away from Southern Wharf. But now came the most perilous part of the journey. The Planter had to pass not 1, but 5 Confederate checkpoints: Fort Johnson, Castle Pinckney, Fort Ripley, Fort Sumter, and Fort Moultrie. At each point, they would need to provide the correct steam whistle signals. As they approached Fort Johnson, the first checkpoint, Robert calmly gave the correct signals, and one by one, they cleared the checkpoints. At Fort Sumter, the most heavily armed of all, Robert held the straw hat low over his face and gave the appropriate whistle signal. But the most dangerous moment was still to come. Once past the Confederate forts, they would enter the waters patrolled by the Union blockade. If the Union ships misidentified them as a Confederate attack vessel, they would be blown out of the water. In a moment of inspired improvisation, Robert ordered the Confederate flags struck down. And in their place, he raised a white bedsheet, the only white flag they had. For a terrifying moment, it seemed that USS Onward was preparing to fire at them, ready to blow them into smithereens. The Union sailors rushed to their battle stations, and the gun ports opened. But then, an officer aboard the Onward, peering through a spyglass, held up his hand. Something was different about this approaching vessel. It was flying a white flag. As the ships drew closer, Robert Smalls stood proudly at the wheel and shouted across the water words that would echo through history. "I've brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." Robert Smalls had done the impossible. He had stolen a Confederate warship from under its defenders' noses and delivered it, along with its military cargo, intelligence value, and 16 souls yearning for freedom, directly into the safe hands of the Union. Meanwhile, as the morning sun crept over Charleston, Confederate Captain C.J. Relia stumbled half awake onto the docks, expecting another day of commanding the Planter. His drowsy eyes widened in shock at the empty moorings, with nothing but gentle ripples in sight. His ship was gone. How could enslaved people, men they considered intellectually inferior and incapable of complex planning, have pulled off such a feat? Well, that's because they had never met someone like Robert Smalls. For his daring escape, Robert was awarded $1,500 by the U.S. Congress, about $30,000 today. The Planter, valued at approximately $9,000 in 1862, equivalent to over $250,000 today, was one of the most significant Confederate prizes of the war. But the true value of what Robert had delivered to the Union was incalculable. Beyond the ship itself, he provided detailed intelligence about Confederate defenses, the placement of mines in the harbor, and weaknesses in the Southern military position. Robert Smalls had not only taken freedom by its horns, but had also transformed himself from property to hero overnight, and his war had only just begun. The story of Robert Smalls could have ended with his escape. He could have settled into freedom in the North, content to have liberated himself and his family from bondage, and many would have considered that an achievement enough for one lifetime. But Robert Smalls was one in a million. Robert's most significant contribution to the Union cause came when he traveled to Washington, D.C. He secured an audience with President Abraham Lincoln himself and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. What was the purpose? Well, to convince them to allow black men to fight for the Union. At the time, the official Union policy barred African Americans from military service. Many in Lincoln's government believed black men lacked the courage, discipline, and loyalty necessary for combat. Typical racist propaganda. But standing before the most powerful men in America was Robert Smalls, the gosh darn living proof of black courage and resourcefulness. And by God, did he argue against these men for the right to fight. His personal testimony, combined with his evident intelligence and bravery, made a profound impression. Shortly after this meeting, Lincoln authorized the enlistment of black soldiers. 200,000 would serve, helping turn the tide of war in the Union's favor. Robert himself returned to the CSS Planter, now a Union vessel, but as its pilot. The man who had once steered the ship as an enslaved laborer now commanded it as a free man in the service of the United States. Over the next 3 years, Robert participated in approximately 17 major battles and engagements. His knowledge of the coastal waters of South Carolina made him an invaluable asset to Union naval operations. But it was during a fierce engagement in December 1863 that Robert's courage would be tested once again. The Planter, now serving as a Union supply ship, came under heavy Confederate fire while navigating the Stono River near Charleston. The white Union captain, overwhelmed by the intensity of the barrage, ordered the ship abandoned. Robert, realizing that capture meant death or re-enslavement for him and his black crew, refused to surrender. Under intense fire, with Confederate shells exploding around them, Robert navigated the Planter out of range of the Confederate guns and to safety. For this act of extraordinary bravery, he was promoted to the rank of captain, becoming one of the first black men to command a U.S. vessel during the war. His salary of $150 per month made him one of the highest-paid black servicemen in the Union forces. Throughout his military service, Robert remained a symbol of what freedom could mean. Not just escape from bondage, but the opportunity to fight for a cause greater than oneself. By war's end in 1865, Robert Smalls had transformed from an enslaved man without rights to a military hero celebrated across the northern states. But the fight for true freedom and equality was far from over. If you're still with us and learning something new, make sure to subscribe. We've got more hidden history coming your way. When Robert Smalls returned to Beaufort after the war, he found a world turned upside down. The South lay in ruins. Former enslaved owners were impoverished, and former slaves, now technically free, faced an uncertain future in a society that had never planned for their liberation. Many newly freed black Americans struggled to find their footing in this new reality, but not Robert Smalls. Using the $1,500 he had received for capturing the Planter, Robert made an investment that was both financially sound and well. It was as if God himself wrote the story. Robert purchased the very house in Beaufort where he had once been enslaved. The property at 511 Prince Street, which had belonged to his former owner, now became the home where Robert would raise his family as free people. This was just the beginning of Robert's post-war achievements. Recognizing economic power as crucial for political rights, he launched several ventures, most significantly, the Enterprise Railroad, an 18-mile railway with a predominantly black board. But Robert's most lasting impact would come through politics. In 1868, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives as the new state constitution was being drafted. Robert, who had taught himself to read and write after the war, played a crucial role in creating the new government in the South. His crowning achievement was authoring legislation that created South Carolina's first free and compulsory public school system. And then, in 1874, just 12 years after he had been considered another man's property, Robert Smalls achieved what would have been unthinkable before the war. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Walking into the U.S. Capitol as a congressman from South Carolina, Robert Smalls embodied the revolutionary changes the Civil War had wrought. The same government that had once legally sanctioned his enslavement now welcomed him as one of its lawmakers. Perhaps most importantly, he stood as living proof that Black Americans could excel at the highest levels of government, but it wouldn't last. As federal troops withdrew from the South and white organizations like the White Knights terrorized Black communities, the political climate changed dramatically. The gains that Black Americans had made began to erode under systematic campaigns of voter intimidation and violence. But despite these challenges, when Democrats regained control through violence and fraud, he filed legal challenges and continued speaking out against Black voter disenfranchisement. In 1895, South Carolina drafted a new constitution specifically designed to strip Black citizens of their voting rights. At the convention, Robert opposed provisions that would disenfranchise Black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and property requirements. Though he lost that battle, Robert Smalls never surrendered the war for equality. Until he died in 1915, he continued to advocate for the rights of all Americans, famously declaring, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." The journey of Robert Smalls from enslaved wheelman to congressional representative represents one of the most extraordinary American stories ever told. It's a tale that challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about slavery, about courage, and about the capacity of the human spirit to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Today, Robert Smalls is finally receiving the recognition he deserves. Since 2023, South Carolina has celebrated Robert Smalls Day annually on May 13th, commemorating the date of his daring escape. Multiple schools, military facilities, and even a U.S. Navy ship bear his name. His home in Beaufort stands as a National Historic Landmark, drawing visitors from around the world. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Robert Smalls isn't a building or a holiday, but the impact he had on countless lives. His work helped open military service to thousands of Black soldiers who fought for the Union. Generations of South Carolinians received education through the public school system he helped establish. Robert Smalls' life reminds us that American history is also where ordinary people, through extraordinary courage, can change the course of a nation. His story stands as a testament to what one determined individual can accomplish against seemingly impossible odds. The man who piloted the CSS Planter to freedom on that May morning in 1862 didn't just change his destiny. He charted a new course for America itself. But Robert Smalls wasn't the only Black man who flipped the power structure on its head. There was another one so bold and uncompromising, the U.S. government labeled him a threat to national security. He didn't steal a warship, he tried to build his own. Click here to watch Marcus Garvey, the Black man too dangerous for America.